There are no confirmed victims. No bodies were ever found. And yet, for 400 years, Elizabeth Bathory has been one of history's most notorious female serial killers. Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson. Elizabeth has inspired Snow White's evil stepmother, the trope of the bloodbath, and centuries of vampire mythology. But what if the legend is almost entirely wrong?
Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian countess, a widow, a shrewd administrator, a devoted mother, and a woman who ran an informal school for young noblewomen on her estate. She was also a healer, someone who brought in medicines and did her best to keep her community alive in the middle of war, epidemic, and political collapse.
And she was accused of being a monster.
Today, we sit down with author Shelley Puhak, whose new book, Blood Countess, digs into the archives of 4 countries to ask, what do we actually know? And what does the evidence reveal about the people who needed her to be guilty?
What she found was a politically powerful widow, a community healer, and a prosecution built almost entirely on rumor, religious rivalry, and one very imaginative Lutheran pastor.
Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts, Shelley Puhak. It's such a pleasure to speak with you about your new book, Blood Countess. Tell us who you are and what was your interest in this book project?
Sure. Thanks first, Josh and Sarah, for having me. And this legend of Elizabeth Bathory was something that I encountered like way back in my 20s, and it had always stuck with me. And more recently, when I saw that there were more and more historians that were questioning whether or not she was truly a vampiric serial killer, I became really interested and dug into the archives to see if we could solve this historical cold case once and for all.
And why does Elizabeth Bathory's story still need to be told?
So I think maybe if I backtrack just for the audience, for folks who aren't familiar with Elizabeth Bathory, if you aren't familiar with the name, you are probably familiar with some of the characters and the tropes that she's inspired, whether that's Snow White's evil stepmother or like the trope of the bloodbath, someone bathing in virgin blood to maintain their youth and beauty. And we even see references to that with like the new vampiric facials where people have like the blood facials, right? And her legend's been dramatized in TV and film. She's been portrayed by everyone from Paloma Picasso to Lady Gaga. And in a nutshell, the legend is she's a Hungarian countess, a real person who lived from 1560 to 1614. And she was accused, although never tried, by the depositions included 300 people of potentially torturing and disposing of hundreds of girls, supposedly noble girls, in her care. And I think there's so much we get wrong about Elizabeth Bathory, like so much. But one of the most surprising things I think I discovered was how closely her case was linked to the religious rivalries among Protestants at the end of the 16th century and how entangled she is with the European witch trials. So we have someone who is a figure who is actually advocating for religious tolerance who ends up being vilified for that.
Thank you. That's great background. So she's this real person, and you were able to go and visit some historical sites and look at records to do your research.
Yeah, so it involved the archives of 4 countries. So it's Austria, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary, obviously. And what's fascinating is with a lot of witch trials, as I'm sure you know, or these sorts of trials in this era, you don't often have sort of the depositions and the testimonies. You sometimes have just kind of the overview, right? And what the sentence was. And in this case, there's a lot of surviving documentation. And there's also some newly uncovered materials that are linked to her personal correspondence or correspondence about her that I was able to see for the first time.
So, what has pop culture gotten wrong about Elizabeth Bathory, and what has it actually gotten right?
I think the gotten wrong side of the equation is much longer. So, I mean, even if you look nowadays, a lot of the images that are out there aren't even of her, right? They're of these other Florentine or British noblewomen that have gotten mixed up. So even her actual image is under dispute. But I think most of the things we've gotten wrong is she wasn't a serial killer. She certainly has no links to vampire legends. Like all of that comes much later. And most of what we know about her, we've gotten completely wrong. Even this idea, and I came into the project with the same idea that where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Like that's somehow, even if we don't acknowledge it, I think a belief we all hold. And so I had this idea that I think many do, that obviously these accusations were exaggerated. That couldn't possibly be this many victims, but there had to be some truth in it. So I was really surprised as you go digging and you discover not only is there very, very little behind this, absolutely nothing, but that she's completely the opposite of how she is portrayed. So this idea of this like haughty, cold, cruel Hungarian, countess who we think of this depraved aristocrat, when in fact she's a very committed, involved, politically active woman who was advocating for and doing her best to kind of promote the rights of other women.
You mentioned the religious rivalries, but there was this grand geopolitical situation going on. Can you tell us a little bit about that so we can understand all these pressures?
Sure. It's really difficult, I think, to do justice in a nutshell. So I will do my best, and this is a gross oversimplification. But I think what you need to know is at the time, the Kingdom of Hungary, which was once sort of one of the leading lights of the Renaissance. I think that's something most people don't know. I mean, they have printing presses way before England and the Netherlands, and most of the places we typically think of as kind of bastions of Renaissance culture had them. So very, very advanced, but they've, been invaded by the Ottoman Turks, and the kingdom has been split into three. And so they've sort of toppled from their former glory. And that's, a real psychic wound for the entire nation. So that's something that they're struggling with. And then we have this divided country, and it's divided politically. So we have one area that's been conquered by the Ottoman Turks. And then we have this civil war that has divided the rest of the country between two claimants. One, the Habsburgs that are ruling, from Vienna, and the other are ethnically Hungarian rulers who are ruling from this Principality of Transylvania. So you have these kind of two powers struggling over this formerly great nation. And the Bathory family, which Elizabeth is a part of, sort of straddles this border, right? They have prominent members on both sides, but they're incredibly influential. So they are rivals to the Habsburgs, to families like the Medicis, incredibly well-educated, very progressive. And when Elizabeth kind of comes on the scene, she has family members that are at the Habsburg court, but then she also has folks that are either rebelling against the Habsburgs actively and is related to quite a few princes of Transylvania. So like the direct enemies of the Habsburgs. So she's entangled in all of this political intrigue. And she's in this family that has, long roots, a lot of influence, and that the Habsburgs are right to be very wary of and keeping a close eye on her.
And how did religious and ethnic rivalries in the area fuel this propaganda war around her case? And you mentioned the printing press, so did that play a role in propagandizing against her?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because I can't help but sometimes see loose parallels to today where we have this completely unregulated technology and people don't quite have a handle on it. And everyone thought it was going to be used to educate the masses. And instead, it's really being used for spreading these sensational true crime stories and conspiracy theories. So each faction controls their own printing press, if we want to think of it. We actually have accusations of fake news on both sides. They use that actual term. And we have this very divided landscape where we not only have the Catholic Habsburgs, this is right after, about 50 years after the Protestant Reformation, but most of Hungary is Protestant. So you have Catholic overlords, Protestant people, and then the people themselves are further divided among the Lutheran, the more, as they call it, the German like religion, and the Swiss/French Calvinists, who are kind of much more radical. And so you have in the West, the Lutherans, in the East, you have the Calvinists. And what's really surprising too is rather than feeling some sense of solidarity against the Catholic Habsburgs, you have Protestants really fighting tooth and nail with one another. And they're using this incredibly pitched rhetoric, right? So, Lutherans are accusing Calvinists of eating babies, and Calvinists are accusing Lutherans of being murderers. And so you have this really pitched language, and then you have the printing press adding to this. So every time there's some sort of dispute, you're having these broadsides and these pamphlets that are essentially adding fuel to the fire. And people are being encouraged to believe the worst of their former neighbors and friends. We have a long period of toleration in Hungary where we have Protestants and Catholics even worshiping side by side, having their services one after the other. But we're entering a period where that's not holding anymore. And we have people that are starting to have fistfights in the streets, denouncing one another from the pulpit. It's an incredibly charged political and religious situation. Tensions are very, very high.
And I think, do we really understand when they accused other Christians of eating babies, they meant it and people believed it. Not everybody, but we should, especially in today's climate, social and political climate, recognize that some of these things that seem like, well, they were just calling each other names. It was serious. People were dying and they were making these allegations that people believed. So she's in all of this, in the middle, and she's a widow. What has happened with her familial losses that is situating her in a vulnerable spot?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this, I guess her vulnerability. And one thing that's happened in quick succession is Elizabeth has lost first her oldest son and heir, then her husband, and then shortly thereafter her powerful brother. So for a while she was a widow. She still has a very young son that she can serve as regent for until he's of age. And she has a very powerful brother who is protecting her. But then when he dies, and there's some questions of whether or not it was poison or not, it's a very charged environment in the middle of a rebellion. So in the middle of a war, her most powerful male protector drops dead. She's in trouble, and she commands an immense amount of very strategic land. These, over 17 castles and fortresses that are arcing across the territory. So they're of immense strategic value to whomever controls them. And so you can see how both sides are, very eager to make sure that she's on their side. And the other thing that you brought up that I think makes her vulnerable and makes a lot of noble women vulnerable in this era that we don't often think of is the fact that noble women are in charge of medical care on their estates. This is not exclusive to Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory's mother-in-law runs a whole hospital on the estates. She has, neighbors who are mixing up ointments and potions for, the Habsburg court. And with this situation where we have ongoing war and rebellion, we have troops coming in and out. So we have already, it wasn't a great era in terms of medical care, right? And life expectancy. But now we have rampant epidemics because every new movement of troops brings something new into the area. So treatments aren't going great. People are not tending to improve, and a lot of them are dying while they're under your care. And, you are subject to this really charged climate. So it's easy to see how a lot of noble women, particularly widowed noble women, became vulnerable. We like to think of them as powerful and independent, but had this specific vulnerability right at this time.
I'm really interested in who Elizabeth was as a person. What can we know about her? What do her letters reveal about who she might have been?
So I want to preface everything I say with the caveat that there are big gaps in the record. We do have a lot of existing materials, but because the Bathory family dies out, there's no one taking charge of the family archive like there are with other families. So we do have gaps in the record. So something could come to light one day that overturns this. But based on what we have and what we know, we have a lot of her day-to-day business correspondence. And we know that while her husband was alive, the two of them shared essentially responsibility for the estate, which is interesting because we can compare that to the relationships of other couples where we might often have, sort of the man dominating, but they're signing off on a lot of these orders, documents, etc., together. And he's clearly making sure that she is well positioned, that when he is off fighting, that she can take the reins and it's a seamless transition. So I know she's a shrewd administrator. We know she really loves, like, for things, I guess, I would say, to take careful account of things. She's a person that measures and takes note of every last detail. So we know she's a shrewd businesswoman. And oftentimes when we have her neighbors saying, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? And she'll say, that's not in my best interest. No, I'm not doing that. So she's not easily sort of swayed or flattered. We know she's a little reticent, that she is invited to a lot of things. She's very, kind of very popular, but she's known for a little bit of reserve. But we also know that behind the scenes, we do see some warmth. So she's a very involved mother. One example I thought was like really charming is you see her son when he's 9 writing in this like perfect stilted Latin handwriting. And while she's away traveling, most of the time she brings her kids with her. She has 2 surviving daughters and a son. But when she doesn't and they're home, she's having them send their homework to her. And there's one instance where he's like, well, I did my homework, and will you bring me back a gift, or will you give me some sort of treat for doing this? So we have that sort of warm relationship. We know that we have her writing to her daughters, for example, after their marriages. But we also have, I think what's most interesting is her writing to her servants and a lot of these exchanges, and to other people in the village. And from that, what we can gather is, one, she seems to have friends from all socioeconomic backgrounds. So she accords great respect to a lot of the village healers and other women that are of commoner backgrounds, but she respects their learning, refers to them as, women scientists. And when they run into trouble, she sends her deputy to make sure that that's straightened out. We know, like, she loved dogs, or seems to have some things like that, these little touches of things she liked or didn't like. But we also know she seemed to like to stay out of things, or at least in the period when she was a new widow and grieving and overwhelmed, that there were a lot of social activities that she said the equivalent of, I can't be bothered. I don't want to do this. So we also see glimpses of a real woman who's grieving at times, who's overwhelmed, who's frustrated, and at times is desperate, who feels the net closing in around her, is trying to do the best that she can by her family, and isn't always successful.
She definitely, well, what I know about her is really right out of here. So you wrote this amazing story based on records that you examined, and this is so great. And what I saw in here was that her motherhood and her plans for the future and her maneuvering through all of this political and religious stuff, it centered around her land like it would for men. Like, I was thinking about that, the gender, like how she does it and how it works for her is totally different because she's a woman, but she was looking to the future for her son and for this dynasty to carry forward. And that was a vulnerability too. But I was really seeing the way that she was corresponding about when she would come or participate and when she wouldn't, the types of things that she said to them. It was really telling of the story you're telling us about her now. So I really recommend to our listeners to get this book and start reading. There's so much in there to learn. And it's an era in a place that we haven't got to spend a lot of time on yet. So this was like a really great introduction. You mentioned the healers and the hospital. So keeping the community within her realm alive was really important. So she was always working to bring ointments in and have medical services.
I think you make a great point about how interconnected things are. And
Yes.
at least my prior concept of how an aristocratic woman went about her day was she was removed from office, right? And she would maybe have these servants she would command, and she would be organizing sort of feasts and festivities. But to see how particularly in this environment, they're like, everybody has to get together on Wednesday to clear the road because we might get invaded. And also, we have this outbreak here that we have to take care of. It's coming from all sides. If we want to talk about multitasking, that you're managing fields, you're managing animal husbandry, you're managing cheese making, like the basics, right? You've got to get everybody fed. You've got to get that food and goods exported, imported. But then you also have to deal with the outbreaks of illness. You also have to deal with seeing to the common defense, making sure that there are these letters where it's like, the river's frozen over. Now people are sneaking over the river. And she's like, please, like, we've got to put up these, people have to stop. You can't come over the river. You have to come in these certain bridges or these certain way stations so we can make sure no enemy forces are sneaking in. And you're collecting taxes. And you're doing this in an environment where most of the infrastructure is breaking down or has broken down. So it's like trying to send a letter when all the post offices near you are on fire and, the FedEx is being robbed. Like, if you want to think of this comparison and you've got to get this message across, the amount of strain day to day, I mean, even just some of these letters for people to get an ointment that they think is going to help their back, and they're having to write a letter to a relative who's 100 miles away, who's getting it from somebody else who's 100 miles away, who's then going to transport it through a war zone. The sense of just the day-to-day pressure, there wasn't that sense of you could rely on a routine, right? And as soon as you think you figured it out, there's a new threat or there's some sort of, like, I guess, new obstacle to try to navigate around.
Plus, she had civil responsibility to fill in her husband's shoes until her son was of age.
Right. So she also has to go to Parliament or make sure somebody else does, all of that. So it's a lot. I think it would be a lot for anyone under the best of circumstances. And I think these are really, really challenging circumstances. You've got war, then you've got rebellion, then you're under suspicion of treason, and you have to make sure that all of this gets done.
So who was George Thurzo, and what did he stand to gain?
So George Thurzo is essentially the prosecutor in this case. He is we might say the number one Hungarian in the kingdom. So after the Habsburg emperor and king, he's their representative. He's the one ultimately responsible for collecting taxes, enforcing the law. And he is a new money aristocrat. Elizabeth is from a very old 500 plus year old established family. So there is some tension there between old money, new money among the aristocrats. There was one point where he really admired Elizabeth and wanted his wife to befriend her and be more like her. But I guess what's important to know is, so George Thurzo's son and Elizabeth Bathory's son are the same age. So they're going to be rivals, right, at one point in time for the same kind of honors and political positions. So there's like kind of a personal potential rivalry. George Thurzo is very, very concerned about Elizabeth's, I'd say, influence, because her nephew is the Prince of Transylvania, and that's one of his arch enemies. So he has like this political dimension. And then there's also religious tensions, because George Thurzo is Lutheran, very devout Lutheran, and he's hoping to usher in this theocracy, right? Now that he's in charge, he's putting in place his ministers, people who are aligned with his religious agenda. And Elizabeth is from a Calvinist family and suspected of being potentially allied with his religious and his political enemies. So he has, a vested interest in making sure, if not seeing to her entire downfall, making sure she doesn't advance too much further.
Let's talk about the accusations he makes against her and that ministerial layer and how that really like snowballed what a monster she was being portrayed as.
A lot of these accusations are that he has heard, it starts off where, he says he has heard from unnamed source that she is responsible for the deaths of the girls in her care. And Elizabeth Bathory is running what is essentially an informal finishing school on her estate. This is not something that she's doing, that she's invented, right? This is something that her mother-in-law did on the exact same estates, and all of her neighbors and friends do. And it's essentially that, it's a form of the apprenticeship model. So just like, a young boy who wanted to become a knight would become a squire to another knight, or someone who wanted to become a blacksmith would be apprenticed to a blacksmith. Young ladies who are expected to marry well and administer a large estate will be apprenticed to a woman who administers a large estate. And this isn't just like etiquette dancing, but also a lot of practical like bookkeeping and beekeeping and things of this nature. So she has a small group of girls at her court, and she's being charged with having potentially tortured and murdered them. Now, when George Terzo starts his investigation, he's doing so at the same time that there's an attempted assassination against her nephew, and one of her cousins like is being swept up, right, and having all of his belongings searched. So the timing's a little odd, but he never mentions who this source is. But when you go through all of the documents, at this point, everything traces back to this Lutheran minister who's in George Terzo's circle named Jan or John Ponikenis. Everybody, when they say, well, I've heard it, and they go, well, I've heard it. And when you trace it back, the only person saying that she's responsible at this point is this Lutheran minister who at some point denounces her from the pulpit. And everyone's very unclear on who exactly she may have murdered. That's one of the interesting things is we have accusations of murder, but we don't have bodies or victims. And it's very difficult for people to figure out who's been murdered. But they're certain she is a murderer. And so there's this scramble to figure out. We essentially have the accusation of a crime and then sort of trying to fit the victim in, where usually it's backwards, right? We have a victim, we have a body, and then there's what happened to, how did this person end up dead? Well, we have an accusation, then we have to try to see if we can find some dead people. And so this minister, though, has been spreading, and then we hear from other ministers, well, I heard from him as well, from Ponikenis, that yes, there's hundreds of young girls that have been murdered at her hands.
Were there actual victims that were produced, or did they know about specific individuals that were missing? Who were these actual victims, that the hundreds of people?
Well, here's the fascinating thing is we don't really have any. There are, when all is said and done, and we go through, and this is after several years and multiple rounds of testimony and investigations, we have 5 or 6 girls who died over the course of 10 years while under her care, not all at the same time. And most of their families testified that they believe it's of natural causes, that they died of an epidemic. So we have these few deaths. And then with some of the other deaths that are alleged, it's almost comical. For example, we have this allegation early on that there were 2 girls who died, maybe one, but they are from an established noble family, the Sitkis. This is this family, these girls died. These are commoners who don't interact with this family saying, I've heard this. Now, this family lives very close to where the notary is taking the depositions. Like over the course of several years, the easiest thing would be to stop and see the family and say, have you lost any daughters? Like, is anyone missing? Is anyone dead? That's never done. And what makes it curious is Hungarian law has a way, just like we have a civil lawsuit, much easier, much lower burden of proof, where you could sue for damages. And in fact, we have lots of instances where families are able to win a civil suit for possible like wrongful death, even when they can't get a murder case or a conviction. So the bar's low, you can get a lot of money. It doesn't really make sense why none of these families would have stepped forward and at least tried. She commands immense amounts of land and money to get a payday out of this. But what you'll see, for example, with this family, they're never interviewed. No one ever says, did their daughters die? And then there's this total confusion about among the witnesses, whether it was one daughter, both daughter, where they died, when they died, and how they died. So we have like kind of these multiple stories, but everybody's heard some version. I think these girls are dead. I think maybe one of them died because they wanted a pair. No, I heard that one was beaten. And the sites of where they were supposedly murdered are like 500 miles apart. So we see this with a lot of the victims, supposed victims, right? Where no one's quite sure. No one talks to their family. No one's quite sure where it happened, how it happened, why it happened, and there's no body. So even when they talk about there's been all these secret burials, there's these bodies, and people are like, well, where are these happening? Where are these bodies? They can't, when there's later an investigation and they're searching, they can't find the bodies. And there's a lot of very extensive search attempt, including the torture of her servants, to try to figure out where these bodies are, because that's critical to the case, right? I mean, if they can just find a few of them, that seals the deal. But there's this real difficulty. And even pastors are like, yeah, I think someone was secretly buried in my churchyard. And they'll say, well, it's the dead of winter. Is there anything disturbed? I mean, that would be difficult, digging a grave when there's several feet of snow on the ground and the ground is frozen. So there should be some sign of it, but miraculously, somehow this was done in the dead of night with no one noticing and leaving no traces behind like the next morning.
Tell us about her surprise arrest and what they're hoping to find and what they do find.
Sure. So we know that Elizabeth will be surprised eating dinner on December 29th, 1610. And at the time, we know the week before that a group of pastors has made a visit to her estate, and they know that there are 5 sick girls there because they've come and they've either, counseled them, prayed over them, but they are aware of that. And we know that one of the girls has died. Again, there's no question that this is not of natural causes. The pastors agree that they've been ailing, they've been sick. Everyone talks that they've been very ill. But somehow George Terzo, the man who's investigating her, happens to be over 50 miles away from his home with his private army at night, in the dark, passing by her house. And his story later will be that, you can't enter a nobleman's home or noblewoman's home, right? That is their right to be secure in their home, right? So you can't invade their property without opening yourself up to criminal charges. So what we have is this curious case where George Terzo says, I was riding through the countryside with my private army at night in the snow, and I happened to see a body across the threshold of her manor house, just right there in the open doorway. And because I saw that, I had to go in and arrest her. And that gave him probable cause to invade her home.
I'm going to get into some of this darker side of this too. What about these witchcraft accusations and cannibalism, diabolism? Where does that stuff come? How does that fit into the story, and where is it coming from?
Yeah, it's great. Like early on, very early, well before her arrest, a good 6 months before her arrest, like the first witchcraft accusation we have is we have this townsperson who says that she's using what I term kind of flippantly a supernatural spying pretzel. And, that seems kind of weird, but when you look more into it, it's really tied to the practice of scrying, things we hear from like the Elizabethan mathematician, like John Dee, who used a mirror to try to see the future. And we also know at this time, given the war, the epidemics, there's a lot of just desperate, grieving people who are trying to speak to dead loved ones or, kind of, right, predict the future. And it also makes more sense when you just, this is like an interesting sort of side note that was like a footnote, but the prosecutor, George Terzo, has relatives who are recorded by reliable sources as trying to conjure angels by saying prayers and talking into a crystal. And so I think with a lot of witchcraft accusations, it's the good Christian practice inverted, right? It's like the same, like, we go to church on Sunday, they have their separate little gathering. So it's this idea that she's doing the exact same thing as his relatives, but she's doing it, in the devilish way. So she's using this cake or pretzel, but in the middle, instead of the mirror or the crystal that they use to summon angels, she's using a host, a communion host, and she's using it to do harm. So it's like taking typical practice and also making her a heretic. So that's sort of the first accusation. Later, we're going to have the widow of a coachman who served her husband say that she's very skilled in magic and sorcerer's crafts. And she says that she's doing incantations and charms to try to kill the Habsburg emperor and to kill George Terzo and a few other people. And then later on, in a letter that Lutheran pastor Panakenis writes, he's also going to accuse her of conspiring with other local witches to use, spells and charms against her enemies. He says that one of the women made an herbal bath for her to soak in. And afterwards, they wanted to use her bath water to bake cakes to bewitch and kill her enemies. And also, the most fun one is that she has this army of demonic cats and dogs that happen to be invisible and no one else can see but him. And they attack him, like when he's trying to climb down the ladder from his attic. He's attacked, and they kind of bite at his heels and nip at his heels until he says prayers and runs them off. So those are sort of the witchcraft adjacent accusations. You also mentioned the cannibalism, which that comes up a bit. And again, this is something that each religious sect is accusing the other, right? So Protestants say Catholics are cannibals, and then each religious sect is saying the other. But this idea that she's having cannibal feasts where she's grinding up the parts of girls and serving them to men as sausages and not telling them. But this is, again, a trope that's taken straight from a lot of the religious pamphlets that are circulating at the time, that this is what our religious opponents do. They kill babies, they eat people. But he makes this accusation that he's heard from, again, an unnamed source, that she's having cannibal feasts.
I just want to real quick highlight Panakenis and his imagination and how horrible he was. Because he, of course, coerces through torture these confessions out of her servants. And this is my first time through the book. But he calls, the devil the mighty lord of cats. And there's a spell that goes with this to bring the cats out to eat the heart of the emperor. That I was just like,
right?
I can't believe I'm reading this. This is so fantastical. And I collect these names for the devil. When I say collect, it's just always fascinating to me to see how he's represented in these stories and what they call him. And I had not seen the Mighty Lord of Cats yet. But that Panakenis, very damaging. He was definitely a key evidence used against her by George. And he knew that was going to be a winning play for him, I'm sure.
Yeah. And also, can we just say, a man completely lacking in self-awareness. Everything bad that happens to him, it's the devil. He has it's this guy who's like, why don't people like me? Why didn't this work out for me? The devil. He never says, I yelled at these people and they yelled back, the devil. And you're like, well, or you're just very unpleasant. And also, he's very upset that no one wants his services, right? I mean, because you get paid by the number of burials and things that you do. And he's really angry that that everybody's choosing to go to other pastors rather than him. And rather than that maybe spurring some reflection, he decides devil, right? There's never anything in the middle. It's either you're his way or devil. And even you can see his animosity towards other pastors that are on his team, that are on his side, that are ostensibly their friends, but he sees no gray. It's black or it's white. And I love, in the most horrific way, but these guys, him and Panakenis and some of his associates, talking about these other women who are being tried for witchcraft and going, they won't confess, and they keep saying they're innocent. And they never once think, they're like, that's just so weird that there's no evidence and that they won't confess. And rather than being like, maybe our case isn't very strong, they're like, nope, devil. I don't know. I would love, I don't know, to be able to bring him back and psychoanalyze him. He's a very fascinating, small-minded man.
Seem to be a number of those guys around then and now. But what role did ointments and alchemy and antimony play in the accusations?
That is a great question. And I think a huge role. And I'm like, where to start, with ointments or with alchemy? I mean, the ointments are fascinating, right? Because that's one form of treatment. People are putting ointments on everything. They love ointments. I thought that was kind of comical. And There's a lot of times where commoners like, I don't think this is working. They're like, just keep putting more ointment on it. It'll be good. But no one knows what's in these ointments, right? And that's one way if you're a healer, that's, oh, it's a super secret recipe ointment, which helps business. But then on the other hand, it's often used against them. There are a lot of women who are a case that's adjacent to this that just happens in the same time period in the same area of a woman who they're like, I think there might be dead babies in her ointment. That's literally the accusation against her. So she's burned as a witch. Or people who say I'm being ripped off. Maybe it's just kitchen grease. Maybe there's nothing in this ointment. You get this ointment, you recover. This person is great at ointments. You don't recover, or it doesn't do its job. You're like, I was either A, being ripped off, or B, there's something devilish afoot, right? So that's an issue. That's one of the main methods of healthcare. I think that's readily accessible. The other is that we have this introduction of kind of heavy metals, right? Along with alchemy, people have been delving into what can we transmute certain metals to, but also this idea of instead of looking to the humors, right? And this idea of balancing the humors or bleeding someone or getting rid of their black bile, this idea that we might be able to use minerals to effect cures. This is where we get the idea of using mercury to treat things like syphilis. But Elizabeth is on this bandwagon of, let's bring in like these new metals. And we know that she's using large amounts and ordering large amounts of heavy metals like antimony, which we also know are going to make a lot of conditions worse and potentially lead inadvertently to some deaths. So that also plays a role. This idea that the progressive set was really into alchemy and really trying to improve healthcare. I mean, what they had wasn't great, but it's also opening them up to a lot of, additional deaths.
I wanted to get into what would historical justice look like for Elizabeth Bathory? How can her image be rehabilitated, or is that the path to justice?
I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think it's a great question, and I don't quite know, but I can say I'm really troubled by the reaction. Like, I think if the equivalent to me would be if we took a victim of the Salem witch trials and we made them into an object of parody. We laughed at them. We dressed up as them. We made movies about them, knowing what we know, right? In some ways, that's really horrific and we're really uncomfortable. If we think about anybody else in that situation, I can think of a lot of other known victims of these sorts of witch trials or politically motivated smear campaigns. Yet somehow it's okay. I mean, there's a new movie out featuring her as this sort of campy, fabulous vampire. There's all of these. She's a mainstay of the horror industry, right? And on the one hand, it can be fun to have these like sort of shared traditions, but it's also we're taking a very real person and a victim. And not just the other thing I think gets lost in this is it's not just Elizabeth. She's the tip of the iceberg. But we also have 2 old women and 1 teenage boy that are 4 servants brutally tortured and then executed. And then we have these other women who were her friends and associates who we know. If you indulge me to talk about this farm administrator for a moment, but also the circle of noble women that come under suspicion. Because when you have a witch hunt, you always have to name your accomplices. And so there's all of these women that are caught up in this. And we imagine how horrific this is, not just for them, but then the trauma for their families. I was even thinking the trauma for Elizabeth's children, which might seem odd, but one of the women that is executed brutally is their nanny. And this has been the woman that has taken care of them from this time they are a baby and sleeps outside their door. And can you imagine hearing that woman that's taking care of you for your entire life is going to have her fingers ripped off and then is brutally executed publicly, and the guys that are your guardian are okay with it. And I don't know what you're told about that, but that's going to be very, very difficult. But all of these people had families. These are small villages, a lot of village ties. So you just think about the enormity of that. And I also think about how there's a lot of these campaigns to at least acknowledge the harm that's done. So I'm thinking about a lot of like the efforts to memorialize a lot of the other victims of the European witch hunts. And even in Bratislava, like itself, there's a great statue, there's a plaque that memorializes this healer, Agatha, who was put to death in 1602. So there's this growing recognition, and I'd really like to see her and the other women that are part of her story somehow acknowledged as part of that, or just for people to begin grappling with this. I think it's easy to, and maybe it's easier for us to make this into something that's so horrific and over the top. It's funny that we don't have to necessarily grapple with the enormity of the loss and the trauma that was inflicted on the community.
It's so important to draw out that human aspect of these stories, that it's humans that are being tortured and killed and accused of things they couldn't possibly have done. And there's that tendency in us too to accuse people of outlandish things just for petty reasons often.
I think I brought her up earlier, so I might circle back, but there's this farm administrator, the Mistress of Miava, who I think of often, and she's one of these peripheral characters. She happens to be a commoner who is a farm administrator. So she's like what, like a very powerful, successful businesswoman who is in charge of like all of the cheese making for Elizabeth. And we also know she's someone who prepares herbal concoctions, somebody who is going to oversee the cows and the sheep and the chickens, is also going to have rudimentary, at least veterinary knowledge. And oftentimes they would also be an herbalist. So we know she's some kind of healer. We don't know how formal that is. And that she's a trusted friend of Elizabeth Bathory's, and she prepares baths for her. They socialize in some form or fashion. But we also know that the pastor is very mad at her, and he comes up with these convoluted ways to tie her into this story. And you can think of all these petty reasons, right? Did he not get enough cheese? Did she not, I don't know, show him the respect he wanted? We can only guess. But this idea that in writing at the end, he's, oh, by the way, and he makes sure to include her in the accusations. And he talks about all these horrific things she does, how powerful she is. And at the end of the letter, he's, oh, but just so you know, in case people are going to be afraid to go arrest her, she doesn't have those powers anymore. So it's all over. So you're just going to find a normal old woman when you go to arrest her. And this idea that he knew what he was putting in motion when he accused her in writing, and he didn't need to. I mean, even if this Elizabeth Bathory case was something he was invested in or was out of his control, but this idea where oftentimes, for whatever petty reasons, these other people, and we know that she is brought in, there's no formal case, but we know she is burned at the stake as part of this. And one wonders too, like who got that land? Who got the cows? Who got the cheese making? What happened with that? So there's all of these other, I think, economic, social, political concerns of just everyday common people that are tied up in this.
And what happened to Elizabeth? How did this end for her?
So Elizabeth was really, really hoping to go to trial. We know that's one thing, and she's on some letter writing campaign, and it's really annoying everyone. And what most of us don't know is how close she came to that trial, that there was actual, preparations were being made. And there was a discussion of whether or not to let her out on bail. Actually, the Habsburg king is going through the negotiations for this. They're getting all the paperwork together for Parliament because she's going to be tried in front of Parliament. And then it never happens. And we might say one reason is because the things that made her so politically important, there's an assassination, and her nephew, the Prince of Transylvania, is disposed of. So maybe they don't need her as a bargaining chip anymore, or maybe they've turned their attention to other things. So the trial never happens. She is going to be under essentially a glorified house arrest in one of her castles for 4 years. She's going to die seemingly of natural causes while still under arrest. One of her last moves when she seems to know she's ill, though, is going to be to try to preserve that land for her family against a son-in-law that's encroaching a little bit. So we do know, at least even in her last moments, she was struggling to try to keep the family legacy together and to fight back as best she could.
One of the complexities that we have grappled with on this podcast, when you look at folklore aside from actual women, even though it's so intertwined, and these legends, we have legends here in the US of they were real women, they become these monster witches. How can we do both? Can we enjoy the legends? Can we enjoy Hollywood and creative fictional literature and honor the real women? What should we do about that? How do you view that? Because especially with Elizabeth, her blood bathing isn't going to go away. What do we do about that?
I mean, I don't know. And I think the best I can come up with too is sort of turning the tables on the men who accused her. If she's going to be parodied, then I want to see John Ponticenes, see this small-minded, like kind of waddling pastor. I'd love to see him out there too, or George Terzo, a closet misogynist. But if we're going to tell the story, then let's tell the whole story. Let's have all the players, where I think oftentimes we just end up with this single isolated woman. And that's how this happens, right? Is we're able to isolate a person from the community. And so I think, I don't know. I think people who have studied this more than I have probably can come up with, I think, more nuanced answers. But that's the best I can come up with is, like you said, she's not going anywhere. This legacy isn't going anywhere. But maybe the treatment that they gave to Elizabeth, they can be subjected to that same sort of kind of scrutiny and parody. That was one thing that really shocked me and surprised me with this case, was how intertwined it was with the witch trials. And I'm glad to get the story out to an audience, I think, that appreciates and is sensitive to the complexity and the injustices that are intertwined with that era.
Thanks for this eye-opening chat, Shelley Puhak.
If this episode raised questions for you about how witch trial accusations were built, who benefited, and who paid the price, check out our rich catalog of expert guest interviews.
You can support the show and pick up the book Blood Countess at the same time. Buy it through our nonprofit bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts. Every purchase supports our work.
Thank you for joining us. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.